Let me ask you a question. Would you ever call up the IRS and say, hey, I want you to take a closer look at my taxes and my finances and just to see if you find anything wrong, and if you have found anything wrong, you can just take all my wealth. Would you do something like that? Probably not. The laughter, I'll take that as a no. Would you call up the FBI and say, hey, I want you to look at my life and my history. I want you to see if you can find that if I've committed any crime, and if I have, I want you to put me in jail. Would we ever call up the FBI and do such a thing? Probably not. Now, would you ever pray to God and say, God, I want you to look at my life, and if I've done anything dishonest, I want you to tear my arm out of its socket? Now, probably not. Even if you live a life that is squeaky clean and you have nothing to hide, we typically don't like to invite investigation or scrutiny. But as you work your way through Job 31, you actually find this very thing, that Job is calling God to take a look at his life and to find anything wrong. In many ways, he's giving a testimony with, you could almost call it a verbal signature. He says in verse 35, "Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me." What we find in this passage is many ways what you could describe almost a parallel with Proverbs chapter 31. When we look at Proverbs chapter 31, verses 10 through 31, we often use that as a passage to describe what the ideal or what the worthy woman looks like in her life of righteousness. In many ways, this is what a righteous man looks like, what Job has laid out. And what he is doing is he is laying out a testimony of his entire life and how he lives his life so that he can be shown to be innocent before God and before men. Because as we know, as you read through the book of Job, he's been accused of many different things. And so what you'll find as we're reading this passage, that as he is claiming his innocence, he'll often swear an oath or swear a curse upon himself to indicate his sincerity. And what I want us to do this morning and this evening is I want us to work our way through this passage and consider the example that Job leaves us to consider how we measure up. So we'll begin in Job chapter 31. And let's begin in verse 1. Job chapter 31, verse 1. And we'll read verse 1 and then we'll move to verse 9. "I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin?" Verse 9. "If my heart has been enticed toward a woman, if I have lain in wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down on her. For that would be a heinous crime, and that would be iniquity to be punished by the judges. For that would be a fire that consumes as far as Abaddon, and that would burn up the root of all my increase." One of the first things I want us to note about Job's life is that Job understands that a righteous life is a pure life. And one of the things that he emphasizes is something that he understands that Jesus will later teach about hundreds of years later, that a pure life begins with our eyes. It begins with our attention and focus. Now, of course, in verse 1, he is being a bit metaphorical. He is not saying that he's never laid eyes upon someone who happens to be a virgin. There's a little bit more of an implication here. The word here for gaze doesn't simply just mean to look. There's a parallel use of it in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 21, where it means to examine closely. Job understood that a godly life was a pure life, a life where you placed a lot of emphasis on what you focused on and what you did not focus on. And in fact, this is so important to Job that he says, "I have made a covenant with my eyes." Basically, he's saying, I've made a contract with my eyes that this is an area of my life that I'm not going to violate. It's very similar to what we find in Daniel chapter 1, where he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself in the land of Babylon. And Job, in many ways, has purposed in his heart that this is a way in which he will not sin. And I think this is a valuable reminder to us because while there is a lot of beauty in the world, there is also a lot of things that are provocative. And in fact, sometimes it may seem difficult to maintain a covenant with our eyes with all the things that are revealed in the world today. However, I think it's important to note that the kind of mentality that Job is describing is something that does begin as a conscious choice, a conscious decision to live a certain way. But as one develops this mentality and this attitude, it quickly becomes a habit and then a lifestyle. And before a Christian realizes it, this covenant that they have made with their eyes has become so instinctive that they guard their eyes and their vision without even realizing it. But as we move on to verses 9 through 12, we see not only does he keep his attention pure, he does not seek opportunities to be sexually impure either. In verse 19, he indicates that he does not lay in wait at his neighbor's door. This is a reference to the idea of waiting for his neighbor to be gone, for his wife to be alone. Job understands that many sins are not something that are committed in a moment or instantaneously, but they're something that are plotted out or thought out ahead of time. Job says, the way in which I live my life is that I do not give my eyes anything to entice me or to tempt me, nor do I seek an opportunity to sin against God. What Job understands is that God not only hates sin, he hates the calculation or the plotting of sin. As we find in Micah chapter 2, verse 1. Woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it, because it is in the power of their hand. Now, I think the principles that Job lays out is very important, because we know that temptation in our life is inevitable. As Jesus says in Luke chapter 17, verse 1, that temptations are sure to come. There's no debate about that. There's no way to prevent temptation in our life. But the kind of habits and the kind of attitude that Job has cultivated in his life will severely minimize many of the temptations that are present. If he guards his eyes, if he guards his focus, if he guards his attention, if he seeks noble things and avoids opportunities to sin, this is one of the ways in which he ensures a pure life. So in short, one of the first things I want us to consider about Job's righteous life is that it is a pure life with pure intention and focus. The second thing I want us to consider about Job's righteous life is his honesty and his integrity. Let's read Job chapter 31, and let's read verses 5 through 8 together. If I have walked with falsehood, and my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance, and let God know my integrity. If my step has turned aside from the way, and my heart has gone after my eyes, and if any spot has stuck to my hand, then let me sow and another eat, and let what grows from me be rooted out. Job calls upon God to weigh his honesty and his integrity. Of course, we know with many things today, their value is determined by weight. If you're going to the store to buy sugar or flour, the cost of it is going to determine by how many pounds you buy. Now, in the ancient world, this was true as well. Much of the value of anything was determined by its weight. However, even when they purchased something, they would constantly use scales to make sure they knew how much of their valuables they were given and how much they were getting in return. And because this was such a common use, we find this metaphor of weights and scales all throughout the ancient world and all throughout the scriptures. We are told by Daniel in Daniel chapter 5, verse 27, that Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, was weighed in the balances by God and was found wanting. We're also reminded in Proverbs 21:2 that every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the hearts. And of course, Job knows this to be true, and this is why he does not ask to be weighed or calculated by his friends. Probably because maybe he's been talking to them a while and he knows that they're not really good at judging his heart. And so he appeals to God and he asks for God to judge him honestly, to see if he measures up to his standard of righteousness. And essentially what he says in verses 5 through 8 is, God, I want you to look at my honesty, and I want you to see if I have deceived anyone or coveted something or desired something unjustly. And if I have, I want you to take away what I have sown or uproot it.
And as we contemplate our own pursuit of righteousness, I think it's important for us to always remember the sacredness of truth as well as the consequences of dishonesty. Dishonesty and deception is perhaps one of the most tricky sins because it is perhaps the easiest to commit and perhaps provides the most upfront benefit. And perhaps one of the tricky things or the alluring things about deception is that there is a great level of anonymity to it. There is a great level of secrecy. For example, there are a lot of sins that are out in the open that if you commit, everyone knows. God forbid you punch someone in the face, everyone's going to know you did that. But if you lie, you may be the only one who knows. And because of the secrecy of deception, as well as its versatility, people from a young age begin to realize that, well, maybe if I lie, this can keep me out of trouble. Or maybe this can protect me from shame and embarrassment. Or maybe I can use this to one-up someone I do not like. And because of this, people from a young age can learn to be dependent on this very destructive strategy for living life. However, the righteous is called to live a life for truth, even when it is difficult, even when it is brutal. But being truthful is not just about saying things that are factually correct or avoiding saying things that are factually incorrect, but making sure that we are presenting the truth in the clearest and most honest way possible. I've often found that what many people struggle with once they finally come to Christ is that they quickly understand that they ought not to lie. However, there is the temptation for some of us to maybe not lie, but maybe manipulate the truth in a way that is more suitable to our needs. And you see this in news articles on occasion. For example, you might read an article from a particular journalist, and it seems as though they have an agenda. And you know that because they might emphasize certain facts and ignore others. They might use softer or more provocative language to frame things in a particular way. I've noticed from time to time when I'm following the news is that if a journalist wants something, a particular protest painted in a more positive way, they will use the term protesters. But if they don't really like the protest, they will refer to them as rioters. Or if there's a particular militant group in the world that they like, they might use the term freedom fighters. Or if it's a particular militant group they don't like, they might use the term terrorist. And this is not unique to the news today. When we go all the way back to Genesis 3, we do find that, of course, Satan did lie about a lot of things, but there were some things that he said that were absolutely true. He very clearly told Adam and Eve that if they ate of the tree of knowledge, they would become like God, knowing good and evil. That was a true thing, but he framed it in a way that was dishonest. And so one of the things that I think we have to ask ourselves and reflect on as we are communicating with others, as we're having conversations with others, that our aim is to speak the truth in the clearest way possible without a particular agenda or motive, but simply be as clear and honest as possible so that we are not guilty of not just lying, but being deceptive as well. Now, there's one other aspect of Job's righteous life that I want us to consider before we conclude today, and then we'll look at a few other aspects tonight when we return. But let's look at Job chapter 31, and we're going to just briefly look at verse 4. Now, one of the things that Job emphasizes in this passage, as well as what is emphasized throughout the entire Bible, is God's omniscience. And with his omniscience, with his ability to know all things, he knows everything about our lives. This is what he says in verse 4. He says, "Does he not see my ways and number my steps?" We also find this idea in Proverbs 5:21, where Solomon says, "For a man's ways are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths." Now, the idea of being watched constantly or being fully known by someone else can sometimes make us uncomfortable. I know this is the case because it seems that whenever I read a dystopian novel, whether it's The Hunger Games or 1984, the bad guy always tries to know everything about you. It's one of the motifs of dystopian novels, whether it's the new ones or the classics. And unfortunately, this has been a trait of evil regimes throughout history. You know, whether it's the Soviet Union or Saddam's regime. I know a guy from Iraq who said that, his father, even though he didn't like Saddam, was too scared to say anything about it because he knew that he might hear it down the line. And we in the West, we love our privacy. We like our secrets. And so it can sometimes make us feel uncomfortable to think that someone would know everything about us. But Job doesn't feel uncomfortable about the fact that God knows everything about him. In fact, as we see throughout this chapter and throughout his life, is that he takes a great deal of comfort in the fact that God knows each of his steps. In fact, the prophet Hanani, in 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 9, he says, "For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to give support to those whose heart is blameless toward him." Job understood that the righteous could take comfort in God's knowledge, and knowing that because God knew everything about his life, could give him the help and the support as well as the vindication that he desired. However, the unrighteous cannot have this kind of peace with God. In fact, those who live unrighteous lives often carry a great deal of secrets. They cannot be as explicit or open about their life as Job is. They can't reveal their search history to others, their travel history, their purchase history. They can't be as open about their life as Job because of their sin. They have to live secret lives, although they are not secret from God. As we find in Hebrews 4:13, it says that no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must all give account. And if a person is in sin, this is a level of peace that they cannot experience, knowing that God has seen everything they have done and noted all their failure. However, for the righteous, for the Christian who is living faithfully, there is a sense of peace that we have, knowing that because of our innocent lives, there's nothing for us to hide. There's nothing for us to be ashamed of. We know that when we lay our head down at night, we have a sense of peace knowing that we have lived today in accordance to the will of God. And as Peter points out in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 13, not only does this enable us to have peace with God, but with our fellow man. He says, "Who is there to harm you if you're zealous for what is good?" And that is why Job speaks so blatantly and so bluntly about his life. This is why he can confidently call these very negative curses upon himself, because he knows he has lived innocently. And it's this innocence and this righteousness that gives him his confidence and peace. So as we begin to conclude, let us reflect on what Job says about his life, and let's compare our life to it. Let's ask, can we live as openly and honestly as Job, or do we feel the need to hide? And if so, what are we hiding? Are we failing to keep a covenant with our eyes? Are we seeking secret opportunities to sin? Have we failed to maintain our sense of honesty and sincerity? And if this is the case, what will we do now? If we are not righteous, now maybe you already are a Christian, but you have allowed sin to creep back into your life. We thankfully have a God who is merciful and is gracious and is willing, if we will confess and repent, to make us righteous again. But if you're here today and maybe you're not a Christian, maybe you have not yet begun your walk with him and attained this righteousness through Christ, if that's the case and you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, you're willing to repent of your sins, to confess his lordship and put him on in baptism, we can help you with that right now. If there's anything we can do for you spiritually, please let us know as we come as you come forward, as we stand and sing.